story about looking. We were looking for a story, for something to tackle that felt far bigger than we were. Something ambitious. We were looking for Steve. Steve Lamb is larger than life. When we met him, he was 63. That was in 2016. As much as I hate how sentimental I am sometimes, I miss those days. For me, it's tempting to look back on 8 years ago as a simpler time. A time when it was just 3 or 4 of us, rolling around a small Gulf Coast beach town with cameras, trying desperately to figure out what type of story to tell about this mysterious guy. Chair?
Oh, yeah. But I'd rather have you sit on my lap. Yeah, I went to jail. 3 squares, a bunk, and a punk. So what, am I supposed to just sit here and ask you questions?
Steve, is there a way that you could take us on a small tour of like the places you've lived and the places you buried money?
This is it right here. I lived on that porch in 1950, the other side in 60. There's a room up there in the 7th. No, yeah. We do whatever you want to do.
All right. Back before we had a finished film. Before we had to deal with questions like, will anyone like this thing we spent 8 years making? Or will anyone ever see this thing we spent 8 years making? Lawyers, licensing, errors and omissions insurance. All of the behind the scenes nitty gritty when you're telling the real life story of a real life person.
Sucked was I fell down the damn steps about 5 days ago, backwards, did a flip and a half. First of all, I landed on here, came back, then hit on this side.
In 2016, I brought 2 cameras to our first shoot. Or maybe it was 3. 2 were film, 1 digital, and they just hung around my neck. No tripods, no lights, no sound. Simpler times. I remember when Jodi pitched the idea to me. She said it was a Florida story and it was for the bitter Southerner. And that's all I needed to hear. I was immediately in. I'd admired the bitter Southerner ever since it launched. They were the hot new online magazine in town. And to me, the hype was well-deserved. The stories and ethos were right up my alley, and the design was gorgeous, immersive, like nothing I'd seen before in online journalism. This was truly a dream opportunity. Shoot photos for a story for the bitter Southerner with my friends and in Florida? Yeah, sounds great. When I think about Florida and the love I have for that insane state, it starts with memories of my childhood. I was born there. My mom grew up there, and her parents, my Oma and Opa, have lived there since the early 60s. And although we moved to Georgia when I was 1, and I was technically raised in Atlanta, I feel like I was raised a little bit in Florida. Because of the visits, usually twice a year, my entire life. The Florida I knew was Fort Lauderdale, specifically Pompano Beach. It was a small beach town with a ton of strip malls. Basically the suburbs. My childhood was climbing in and around huge banyan trees in the park and catching green anole lizards with my brother. It was riding in my Opa's green 79 Volkswagen bus down to the beach. It was seeing gators one day in the Everglades and the next day riding razor scooters around the neighborhood with my cousins. The air smelled different. It was the wildness of it all, a different world. And even though we rarely left the small town feel of Pompano Beach, the entire state felt like a playground to me in comparison to the cul-de-sac I grew up living on in the suburbs of Atlanta. And I'm grateful for my Georgia life, but we're talking about Florida right now. So back to 2016, the aforementioned simpler time. At that time, I described myself as a fledgling photographer. I was 30, 31. I'd been in Atlanta 2 years after spending 11 in Athens, the famous college music town, which is a whole other podcast. In Atlanta, my roommates and I had this grand idea to turn the big green house we were renting in Cabbagetown into a space where once a month we would host a different visual artist and drink 20 cases of craft beer. The best craft beer in Atlanta, I should add. We just thought, why don't we have all the most talented artists come to us? And this community, the one we created by bribing Atlanta artists with free beer to come hang out, is one that I'll always cherish. And one that Jodi and Gresham came out of too. At this point also, I had spent the past decade on film sets as a boom operator. That's the guy who holds the mic above his head and whom everyone yells at about shadows, reflections, and sometimes the mic actually being in the shot. It was good money, and I spent most of it on travel and the rest on my band. And I did take a lot of photos in that decade. I loved shooting on film, I still do. When Jodi approached me about this project, I'd been seriously making short documentaries around the Southeast for 2, maybe 3 years. I was kind of slowly attempting to phase out the sound work and making several short docs a month. Thanks to a dear friend who took a chance on me, hiring me to make short portrait-style films about local Atlanta artists. That was when I started hiring Gresham to create scores. He's Jodi's husband now, but I knew him before they met. Back in Athens, Georgia, where we both went to college and had our bands, we were kind of rivals. We ended up on a misbegotten trip to Uganda in 2013, and although that trip was chaotic and a story for another day, Gresham and I became fast friends. To put it simply, he's brilliant. And as I was experimenting with making these short docs around Atlanta, I knew I wanted his chaotic, intuitive, and unpredictable brain to write the music for them. That was the beginning of what's now become close to a 10-year creative partnership between Gresham and I. And Jodi, we've been friends for about the same time I've known Gresham, in the Athens, Georgia music scene, and then around Atlanta once they moved there. I took their engagement photos. I over-imbibed at their wedding, and at the end of the night climbed into a friend's van, which used to be my van, and is now my van again, and passed out on a couch while barely saying any words to anyone. I say all these things, slightly embarrassed at how much drinking I was doing when I lived in Athens, to hopefully provide a slightly more colorful context as to why I would immediately say yes to driving my 2001 Honda CR-V down to St. Pete Beach, Florida with these two for a project I assumed we were doing for free. More on that later, and more on the CR-V later. So we went, in my little CR-V that Gresham affectionately came to start calling the go-kart. The story that hooked us was this. In 1973, 7 men were caught with 9 tons of weed in a small, sleepy fishing village on the Gulf Coast of Florida. It was called Steenhatchee. It was the biggest pot bust in the country at the time, and it shined an enormous flashlight on the Gulf Coast, specifically St. Pete Beach, and what had been happening and what still was happening there. And what was happening was kids, 18, 19-year-olds who grew up on their dad's boats, grew up on the water, were taking those boats to Jamaica and Colombia and coming back with tons and tons of weed, creating distribution networks and running around with millions of dollars in cash, burying it in their backyards, wrapping it in tape, dipping it in polyurethane to waterproof it, putting it in igloo coolers, and hanging it beneath docks underwater. This is before the DEA even existed. And suddenly, with this bust, everyone knew about it. Our goal was simple: find anyone who was either there for the bust, knew someone who was, caught someone who was, or even knew it happened. Anyone who would speak to us. And the first person we found was Charlie Fuss.
I knew the guys in Steenhatchee because they grew up in my neighborhood.
And if you've heard episode 1, which If you haven't, you should probably go back to listen to it. It's great, and it goes more into the details of the man himself and how he led us to Steve. So we met Charlie and his wife Carol Ann at their beautiful home on St. Pete Beach. Shades of navy, sky, and periwinkle blue were everywhere in this house. A true Navy man. And sailboats, drawings of sailboats, models of sailboats. Charlie and Carol Ann were nothing but the most warm, friendly, and welcoming couple we'd encountered. I remember feeling instantly calm. Being invited into essentially a stranger's home with cameras is something I'm not sure I'll ever get used to. I just had my stills cameras, so Jodi and Gresham sat and chatted with Charlie while I walked around the room. There was a lot of beautiful sunlight coming in through the window where Charlie sat, so I took advantage of that. We ended up documenting Charlie in that chair by the window a total of 3 times. The first time I shot stills. The next 2 were filmed.
So there were a whole bunch of youngsters who were, getting out of high school, were looking for jobs. Some were going to college, not everyone. And this was a great opportunity for them to get into a business if they were willing to take the risk. And the major risk to those guys in those days was getting drowned, not getting caught. I mean, you're going in a 30-foot small boat all the way down to Jamaica through the Yucatan Channel, and you didn't know what kind of weather you were going to have. But they were able to do it, and they could bring back 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tons, and stacked up in plain view.
Charlie was absolutely integral to our article. He provided a bird's eye view context to this world that we very much needed. And again, Jodi covered a lot of it in her episode, but here's a key point that I've always found fascinating.
And in 1969, they had a terrible drought in Mexico, and marijuana crops down there just were wiped out. So there was a huge shortage, and guys, and the market had grown at the same time. And people who were interested in supplying that market figured, well, we're going to have to go somewhere else. And Jamaica was one of the first places that came up because you could grow marijuana in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica, and it wasn't that hard to get to.
There was a drought in Mexico, and so a lot of the weed smugglers had to look elsewhere to meet the demand. We could think about it from a Malcolm Gladwell Outliers perspective. If you haven't read Outliers, it's a popular nonfiction book from the early 2000s that argues that the most successful people in their respective crafts throughout history got that way because not only were they talented and hardworking, but they were more importantly born in the right place to the right community at the right time.
So there were a whole bunch of youngsters who were, getting out of high school.
In the book, Gladwell talks about the 10,000-hour rule, that it takes 10,000 hours to be truly great at something. But the point of the book isn't that these quote-unquote outliers throughout history, Bill Gates, J.P. Morgan, the Beatles, they didn't put in 10,000 hours sheerly by their utter grit and determination. The time and circumstances they were born into provided those 10,000 hours. An example from the book, Bill Gates coming of age as a high schooler at the precipice of this new age of computers, the right time. And his mom, who lobbied his local high school to give the students unlimited access to this new thing called a computer lab. The right place and the right community. So then think about the smugglers. These young dudes who grew up on the water, grew up on fishing boats, they had their 10,000 hours, so to speak, and they luckily were relatively close by to places like Jamaica and Colombia.
And it wasn't that hard to get to.
You introduce these kids who were born at the right time, in the right place, and had the right skills to take advantage of this opportunity.
We didn't have that many people out there looking for them in those days.
You have all the ingredients for a huge money-making venture. Which takes us finally to Steve.
Couldn't even move my body. Couldn't even get out of bed. And God, he couldn't even wipe your ass. It hurt so bad.
Our man, the protagonist anti-hero of The Green Flash, the one we grew to love deeply while still always being confounded by.
Get this on film, brothers, please.
I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our partners, Last Prisoner Project. The Last Prisoner Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to cannabis-related criminal justice reform. As the United States moves away from the criminalization of cannabis, giving rise to a major new industry, there remains the fundamental injustice inflicted upon those who have suffered under America's unjust policy of cannabis prohibition. Through intervention, advocacy, and awareness campaigns, the Last Prisoner Project works to redress the past and continuing harms of these inhumane and ineffective laws and policies. We're using our film, The Green Flash, and this podcast to help the Last Prisoner Project raise money and awareness. Visit www.lastprisonerproject.org or text FREEDOM to 24365 to donate and learn more. Now, back to the episode.
What stands out for Jodi and I both, in retrospect, is just how different Steve and his story were from what we thought they'd be.
So before we knew this was a documentary, what did you expect when we came down there?
I guess I knew at that point when we came down to report the story, I knew that we had found something interesting just in kind of the time and place that we were covering. But I did not think, I really underestimated what fascinating and funny and round characters we would meet. And I think that's what made me really love it and love it instantly and want to do something more with it, as I think the tone in my mind for that story that I wrote and you photographed, I thought that the whole thing was just going to be kind of edgy crime story, serious and straightforward, and instead we met these kooky, aging people who loved their families and their hometowns and were wearing their own promotional shirts.
Ethan here, just taking a quick second to let y'all know about some friends of ours, Look Alive Coffee. Look Alive is a small batch coffee roaster out of St. Pete, Florida. They make fresh, seasonal coffees to fuel whatever you're working on. Whether it's a painting, a playlist, your favorite book, or a podcast based on a film, they're here to keep you energized and inspired. You can find them at lookalivecoffee.com. Now back to the show. We met Steve Lamb for the first time for lunch at a spot right on the water called the Seahorse. He was 63, but seemed younger. Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and nervous, excited energy. And when I say nervous, it wasn't that he was nervous to talk to writers, photographers, press, and all that. He seemed nervous that he wouldn't get to tell everything because there was so much to tell. Like there wasn't enough time to tell his story. Like a kid who can't wait to tell you about their day. And I don't think that ever changed.
That's my story, and I'll stick with it.
He was wearing a yellow shirt that had The Smuggler's Ghost on the back and on the left breast pocket. That's the name of his book that he sells around town. The one that he's known for. The one Charlie Fuss wrote the introduction for.
And said, will you write a note? And I said, what the hell are you talking about? I was on the other side. I was trying to stop you guys.
We had seafood, peel and eat shrimp, and him a grouper sandwich, I want to believe. After lunch, I got in his 90s black Plymouth Neon, and Jodi and Gresham followed us in the go-kart. The ride was a little harrowing, as at almost every turn, Steve was pointing and explaining some street corner or dock or house on the beach where he had a memory. He took us on a tour of St. Pete Beach, where we began to see firsthand just why this place was considered a smuggler's paradise.
Yeah, it was almost like one big family. Beach is 6 miles long. Just enjoyed living. I mean, even back then, we gave thanks that that we were born on a beach.
Steve took us down to a collection of keys south of St. Pete Beach. Specifically, Fort DeSoto State Park is at the end, and it was a lucrative unloading spot for smugglers back in the day. As we drive along thick mangroves on either side that lay between us and the water, I'm struck by how even in 2016 it felt wild. Mostly because it was designated a state park. You have to pay $5 now. A fact that Steve despises and wouldn't stop talking about the first time we went out there with him. He spent his entire life here, surfing, fishing, swimming, driving boats among the keys. Like a kid who returns to his sandbox only to find a tall kiosk and a stern woman in tan clothes demanding $5. As remote and beautifully pristine as it is now, thanks to the state park, it was even more then. Steve points across the bay to the rest of St. Pete Beach and Johns Pass, the developed side. He said there was nothing there then in the 70s. He told us,
all those boats and everything behind us, there was none of that. This was all sand spurs and sand lots. Now, you can't find a vacant lot out here. It's all just mansions. Back then, nobody wanted it. You could have probably bought the whole place for a left shoe.
You could feel a sense of ownership and love that Steve has for this place, and for good reason. Growing up, it was basically all he had. He grew up poor. His dad was a merchant marine and would leave for large stretches of time until one day he never came back. His mom did the best she could with 3 kids, Steve and his 2 sisters. She was a waitress, and Steve remembers her crying at the dinner table over her tips. Steve got a job at the local pool hall when he was very young, like 12. And it was there that he first saw surfers come in.
Just a lot of the older surfers came up and were smoking when they'd take breaks. And I'd see the little brown stain on their finger and just knew it was pot. Then I started seeing people making money on it. A friend of mine who got a pound, he fronted me ounces. And they were for $150 or $100 a piece. I was selling them for $150. So I was making, more money than my mom made working on tables all night. Worked out good. I'd make, $500. So I'd give that to my mom and help her out. And once I saw that kind of money, I just got into it. I didn't have a father. He left when we were real young. So I was always told, you're the man of the house, Stevie. You're the man of the house. And you got to take care of your sisters and your mom. So I just went at it. I saw the money and it was fun to do and started smoking pot and just became a pot smuggler.
This led to a life of such adventure you couldn't help but envy. Like the first time he went to Jamaica, he was sleeping on the deck of a cargo ship at 16 under the Caribbean stars at night.
I ran into a guy from St. Pete, and he goes, hey, you can get on the Federal Palm. And it's a mail boat that goes through the Caribbean, and you pick it up in Tobago and go all the way up to Jamaica. And it's only $52 for 14 days of traveling. You sleep on the deck with the hogs, the dogs, pigs, and cats and rats, and all the natives from one island to the next. And that was a time of my life.
Taking boats with his childhood buddies down to Colombia.
All my brothers from different mothers.
Barely surviving, but coming back with thousands of pounds of weed valued in the millions of dollars. It was a life lived with reckless abandon on pure adrenaline. Reading his book at 31, there was a part of me that honestly felt like I'd wasted my life. I mean, was it insanely reckless? Yeah. He talks about buying brand new trucks with cash, crashing them, and then going back and just buying another one. But aside from the stupid teenager with money type of stuff, this guy experienced so much adventure. Isn't that the way life should be lived? Mine felt devastatingly boring by comparison. This guy lived an incredibly exciting life before he got caught at 20 years old with 9 tons of weed. Not to mention what happened after. As Gresham, Jodi, and I parted ways with Steve, we were exhausted and our minds were spinning. There was so much. The 3 of us went to the beach near John's Pass so I could grab some last few Gulf Coast sunset shots. We talked about all we'd witnessed. One thing was nearly an early death. Our death. My left front wheel had started making a strange noise about day 2 or 3 of the trip. We examined it and couldn't see anything wrong with it. It wasn't flat, but the noise was awful and gave us pause. Also, it was Sunday. Thankfully, the friendly neighborhood pet boys didn't observe the Sabbath. They were open. So I left Gresham and Jodi in downtown St. Pete to eat some Cuban food and drove loudly over to our Sabbath saving grace. Turns out, when I bought new tires the week before, they hadn't been tightened all the way, and my left front wheel was close to flying off the car. Give thanks in all things, I guess. Definitely to the Sunday shift at Pet Boys. They fixed it, and I sheepishly headed back. Also, we did end up talking to one other smuggler. He wasn't a part of the original Steenhatchee 7, but did his own thing and knew all those guys. He was also writing a book. It wasn't finished, but he claimed he had like 1,000,000 pages written. Everyone we talked to seemed like they had a book. They lived this insane life. Parties, money, drugs, surfing, the Paradise Beach life. But now they were older, and they had stories. But was that all they had? What else was there? I can't remember how it came up, but in the car with newly safely tightened wheels, I mentioned how honored I was that Jodi asked me to take photos for this project. That it's the stuff I'd rather only be doing, even if it's for free. And Jodi started laughing and said, "Dude, you think we're doing this for free?" Once again, here's Jodi and I talking about that moment.
And do we want to talk a little bit about that moment where I realized that I wasn't working for free on the first?
Yes, yeah, because okay, now I'm like, now I've got all kinds of questions about what you thought the setup was all the way through. Like, so
like I admired the Bitter Southerner so much that I of course would have done it for free, and I expected that I would. And I think I was so working for exposure bucks and working for goodwill at that time in my career that I just expected that this was part of it, that we were like kind of asked by the Bitter Southerner, but it was kind of like on spec. And anyone, and this was true, anyone would have loved and still would love to create for the Bitter Southerner.
right.
But it was the end of the trip when I don't know what I said, but you were like, you know, we're getting paid, right?
It's so amazing. It's such a compliment and so generous and so on brand that you would do that.
What do you mean on brand? Oh, because I'm used to working for free?
No, because you are that generous that you would be like, oh, sure. Like my friend is asking something of me. You would never ask, what am I going to get in return? This is just like how you operate as a person.
Oh, no, I mean...
And so then it probably comes as a genuine surprise that you are doing something professional. Professionals perform a service and get paid.
Yeah, that's so funny. Well, because it's like, from my perspective, it's like, oh my gosh, my friends want me to help them do something cool.
And that's
Of
all
course.
you need to hear. That's very nice.
Of course. Let's do it. And
Very admirable.
maybe this could turn into... It's always... The artist like who's starting from scratch and doesn't have funding from outside is always starting from a place of like, what could this turn into?
Right.
What could this lead to? Mm-hmm. You know? So then in that moment being like, oh, I'm actually going to get paid to take photos? You know?
It was very trusting
It was awesome.
of you.
It was awesome. It was really, really fun moment. I was like, whoa.
Wow.
That's fun. What a fun bonus. What a fun bonus to do what you love with your favorite people and get paid.
It's wild.
We all laughed, and I remember Gresham remarking, and I'm awkwardly paraphrasing, but it was something like, y'all two are going to be great creative partners in this and in other things, because Ethan went this whole trip thinking he was working for free and was fine with it because he believed in you and the project. And he was right. Doing projects with friends can be tricky, but I trusted them both creatively and felt confident in them, in this, whatever it was, or would turn out to be. I felt okay placing a bet. I didn't know it would be 8 years, but hey. So we went looking for a story, and we found one with Charlie and Steve. Then we went to a beach bar to see if we could find pina coladas. We found them.
Looking for the Green Flash is a podcast written and produced by
Ethan Payne.
Gresham Cash.
and Jodi Cash. It features an original score and sound design by Gresham Cash. We made this podcast to support the premiere of our first feature-length film, The Green Flash. This August, we're taking The Green Flash on tour throughout Florida and Georgia. We'll host screenings and special events at independent theaters from St. Pete Beach to Key West to St. Augustine before we bring it home to Athens and Atlanta. For more updates, follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Green Flash Documentary, and sign up for our newsletter at www.thegreenflashdocumentary.com. Thank you so much for listening to Looking for the Green Flash. We'll be back with another episode next Monday. We'll see you in the movies.